Welcome, everyone, to another Voice with Vervaeke. I'm very happy to be here with a very good friend of mine, somebody I've talked to in many occasions, both virtually and in person. Um, Somebody I have a tremendous amount of affection and respect for, and it's Paul Vander Klay. So, Paul, it's just great to have you here, and you're looking well, and I'm glad to see that. So, in case, although I doubt it, anybody on my channel doesn't know who you are, who are you, and why are you interested in my work, and why are you here specifically today?
Well, I'm a minister in the Christian Reformed Church, which probably seems like a very strange thing to have roaming around these corners of the internet. I got onto YouTube when I was curious about Jordan Peterson's work, and so I made a video. And I didn't know anything about YouTube really, or what would happen with the video. And suddenly, all kinds of people started following me, which was unnerving. And because I'm a pastor, I started talking to these people, and just sort of went from there. I've used YouTube to just sort of process ideas. Everything's pretty much rough draft that I put on YouTube. I'm just exploring the world. And then a lot of people sort of came around to explore with me. And that's where I bumped into Jonathan Peugeot. And then somebody who was listening to my work said, "Oh, you have to look into this John Vervaeke guy." And so then I, as I often do, I'll just look at somebody's videos and I'll make some comments. And then John contacted me, and we've developed a friendship since then. We've done some events together, and we've spoken a number of times. And this has been over 5 years or so now.
Yeah.
And so I have kind of a weird space in that a lot of pastors on YouTube sort of use YouTube to sort of just promote their own churches or promote their own little corner of belief. I'd much rather sort of use YouTube to build relationships and explore ideas. And some people don't like that I don't do the other as much, but you can listen to my sermons if you want to listen to that stuff. But to me, the opportunities here are to sort of explore with one another and learn from each other. And, very much in John's work, look for opportunities for dialogos where we can, and John, John said such gracious things about me. Right from the start, John was astoundingly generous, patient, warm, and what I've been amazed by is even when we're doing live events together, just getting to know John and his heart. And I have nothing but love and respect for John and his work, even though obviously we have disagreements with some of the ways we see the world. But to me, those disagreements just make it all the more interesting. So
Thank you, Paul.
That's why I'm here, I guess.
So before we turned the cameras on, you said you've been, and I've seen some of them, and you've been doing some videos around the IFS phenomena. I've done a bunch. I've done some with Seth Allison, who is significant IFS thinker, practitioner. I've done some with Kazra. I can't remember Kazra's name. He's important. He's a professor and also a practicing therapist like Seth. Just did one with Mark Lewis, who you've heard me mention before, who's also an important cognitive scientist, but has also been practicing IFS therapy for, I think, over a decade now. And so I've been also pursuing this. And there's been a lot of things that have been happening through that for me. And some of it has stirred up some dust, I guess, some of the things I said. And I'm really welcoming the opportunity. Although you're on my show, I expect we'll be talking about this topic a lot. So I really welcome the opportunity to talk to you about it, because I think you'll listen with an open mind and a reflective heart. So I thought we'd talk about that. Maybe I could begin by sort of introducing what it is and how I became interested in it, and some of the connections I see that it makes. So IFS is part of a growing convergence. And I talked about this in After Socrates as well. A growing convergence within the psychotherapeutic community around dialogical practices, parts work, personification techniques, empty chair techniques, etc. There's a lot of convergence around this idea that if we move into just talking to the therapist, but instead somehow engage with talking with our parts, and we'll come back to that, we can see very effective transformation in people. In fact, Mark Lewis, we're going to release that video very soon. I took up IFS because of his recommendation, because he said to me, and he stood by it in the recent video, that he was able to get in IFS in months where it took other therapies years. And I was like, oh, Mark is a pretty skeptical guy. He's a good scientist. And so, Mark's been through the ringer. He's been an addict and he studied addiction. So this is somebody to take seriously. And so I did. And I took it up. I took it up for two reasons. I took it up because during COVID, I was going through, as many people, some personal struggles that I won't get into. And one of the things about IFS, it was recommended to me by Mark, but also IFS is designed to be done both on your own and with other people. So I had a beloved friend of mine, Christopher Mastropietro, and we took turns doing IFS with each other. One of us would be the guide, and we were going back and forth. We're going through the book on IFS self-therapy, etc. That was going on. And while that was happening, I was starting to get very interested in dialogical models of the self that were also now burgeoning in cognitive science, but have a very ancient provenance because, of course, Plato talked about this. And there's the whole tradition of the daemon, not the demon, the daemon, or in Latin, the genius or the muse. We've got all these different entities that are sort of, well, I would use the word transjective. They're not really purely psychological, but they're not completely independent. And so they're metaxu, as Socrates famous said. And of course, one of my heroes, Socrates, had such a part. He had a voice that would speak to him and tell him his daemonium, or his daemon, as it was called. So all of this became very important to me. And then the part that has really sort of provoked a lot of people around that is, oh, that's fine. Yeah. I did something similar, Gestalt therapy. You talk to your older self and you talk to your younger self. You go between the chairs, or active imagination and Jung. But what people forget, of course, is Jung had some very powerful experiences that are analogous to what happened to me, which is I was doing IFS on my own. And I found, and many people have found this, writing IFS rather than just speaking it or imagining it, very much more effective. And Schwartz talks about this. And I think that's one of the advantages of IFS over Jung's active imagination. It doesn't require people to have great facility with mental imagery in order for it to be properly efficacious. And I think that's important. And I was doing IFS. And I'll try and describe this as sort of just sincerely and phenomenologically as I can. I was in the middle of it, and I've gone through Jungian therapy, so I'm familiar with the difference between sort of stuff in your head and a numinous archetypal presence that comes up in dream work or active imagination. And wow, was this an archetypal presence? It just came in, boom. And I'm doing this gesture because it just sort of, okay, put all this away for now. I want you to talk to me. Of course, who are you? Right. And I got the answer, Hermes. I'm Hermes. And I was, of course, startled. There wasn't anything like this in the ontology of IFS, although I found out by talking to Seth Allison that Schwartz actually now has come around to think there might be a place for these kinds of, I'm going to do this in a really philosophically neutral sense, entities. And now I fortunately had one of my very good friends who is a practicing therapist, Jungian and beyond, Anderson Todd. And he knew about Raph's work on what's called ally work. Apparently, a lot of other people have had this kind of experience, frequently overlapping with active imagination or IFS or things like that. And it's about entering into a dialogical relationship where you have regular conversations, um, with with your ally, and I have had those on an ongoing basis. And then, of course, I got more and more into what's going on, and the Neoplatonic revival, uh, largely because of people like Gregory Shaw, who I got to meet recently at Harvard, and all the work he's done on Iamblichus and Theurgia, and the new book he has out on Hellenic Tantra, and all this kind of stuff. And you realize this was an ongoing thing in the Hellenic world and deeply within the Neoplatonic tradition. And I've even got some books, and I hope this doesn't irk any of the Christians who might be listening because Paul's here. But there's a lot of people who have argued it was actually taken into the Christian tradition from Proclus into Dionysius, and there's a continuity between Theurgia and liturgy in a really important historical fashion. So that, of course, deeply fascinated me because of my ongoing interest. That's why I was at Harvard. The title of the conference is Platonism as a Living Tradition. My ongoing interest about how can you make this a living tradition again. And so part of what I've been doing is having these ongoing, fairly regular, usually at least once a week, sometimes twice a week or more, where I sit down and I dialogue with Hermes. This has been enormously beneficial. Contrary to a lot of people's concerns, some of them expressed a little too reactively. Some people with a lot of loving concern. So I want to be very open. This hasn't turned into me losing my agency. It hasn't turned me into somebody seeking after a particular religion. It has not asked for. Hermes has not asked for worship. I talked to Hermes about Jesus, and that conversation has actually been very, very important for some deep transformations about my relationship to Jesus that have showed up in important ways and in important places. I was recently at the Gospel Seminar that Jordan Peterson was recording, and those conversations, and one of the first things Hermes did was, he said, you know what? You should read the New Testament again. Okay. Okay. I like stuff like that. So there's it, and how I talked a little bit about this on a video. You mentioned the philosophical Silk Road about this has had a really huge change for me. Hermes is a participant in that shift from the religion that's not a religion to the philosophical Silk Road to I'm not a Christian, but I have a new relationship to Jesus of Nazareth that is becoming as present to me as Socrates is, as a sage that I've internalized. And it's launched me into looking at a whole bunch of new, really cool cognitive science, like the new book, Presence by, what's his name? Anderson Day, talking about like third man factor to sense of presence. And we can talk about all that, going back into lucid dreaming and some of the work that's done there, what's going on in psychedelic experience and the entities that people meet. And it's like, oh, there's a family of phenomena here. I don't deny that it might be a place in which evil can operate. I'm not stupid. And self-deception could be prominent. Also, I hope I'm not stupid. But I also know that there are a tremendous number of people in a tremendous number of situations using all of these things and it being very powerfully beneficial. And so that's where it is. That's where I'm at.
Okay. Part of what interests me about this is when I would look at, let's say, the theist-atheist debates of 10, 15, 20 years ago, I would often ask myself, well, what's really at heart here? Because, certainly you sort of have the propositional level where people are saying, oh, does this or doesn't this exist? Okay. What always occurred to me was that what really would sort of trigger the new atheist types was the relationality with which people asserted relationships with God. The theoretical existence of God didn't really sort of bother them so much. People can believe in God, so on and so forth. Keep it private. But the question of relationality was a big deal. And in one of our earlier talks, we went into this quite a bit in terms of the spirit of finesse and the spirit of geometry, how a relational posture is one of it's one of exchange, it's one of back and forth, it's one of give and take. And I think part of the filter of the Enlightenment was a demand that, at least in some realms of public exchange, that we limit agency to human beings with skin around us. And a big part of the conversation that you and I and Jonathan Peugeot have been having has been about collective cognition, agency, hyper objects. And what's really struck me about, at least the little that I've learned so far about IFS, and what you've just said right now is quite interesting in terms of it is both something that you do with someone else and something you do on your own. And now your ongoing dialogue with Hermes, to me, again, looking at this through the eyes of a pastor who, I remember there's a video on the internet of Dallas Willard. He was a professor of philosophy at University of Southern California. His area was phenomenology. Just noting how in certain areas you could talk about some things and not talk about other things.
Yeah.
And you basically had sort of a filter through which certain kinds of information and registers were allowable and others were not. One of the things that I see is that religious people, I remember I was delivering lumber when I was in college. That's how I worked my way through college. And on big loads, I'd have to go with somebody else, and me and this other driver, we sat down for lunch, and as was my practice, before I would eat lunch, I would simply bow my head and give a silent prayer. And the other guy's like, "What are you doing?" And I said, "Well, I'm praying before I eat." "Oh, well, don't do that again." I said, "Okay, I'm not meaning to disturb you or anything like that." But this idea that in some ways, Christians and other religious people are strange people who have relationships with, and then with all kinds of beings. I know many Christian people who, let's say after a loved one dies, I was home and then, something happened and my father was sort of there through that. And, and you begin to realize that there's this whole level of relationality that people are regularly practicing, and it's extremely natural for them. And then when I began listening to some of these videos by Robert Schwartz, and I was very interested in the ones where the video would sort of then go into practice, where they were doing this practice together. And because for me, I was a little bit curious about, okay, how exactly does that work? Because in a religious context, there's usually liturgy and form, sometimes a very thin form, but there's form around this practice, and say bowing your heads and closing your eyes. And this is obviously very common in religious contexts. And so it was very interesting to me to see, okay, how much of what kind of mode shift is happening? I mean, and what people are doing, and what I would observe is that people would often close their eyes, which of course isn't unusual to something like this. If we want to concentrate on something, we often close our eyes. We close our eyes so that we can visualize in our mind instead of necessarily having the interruptions of visual stimulus. So to me, a lot of this seemed quite important in terms of the public and even the scientific regard for this kind of dialogical models. And then, of course, I mean, when I would watch this, the IFS didn't seem in any way crazy to me, because for a long time, people have commonly sort of regarded themselves as having an internal community and these pieces of myself. And so so then to see this develop as a regular practice, as a practice that seems increasingly accepted in at least the therapeutic community, which usually at least tries to draw credibility by its relationship with science.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And people are doing studies that say, okay, just like Mark Lewis said, you can get to in months what in other forms of therapy you looked at in years. Now, I tend to think that it's often these kinds of practices that mold and shape our sensibilities that eventually will sort of migrate down into our implicit ontologies.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And so, to me, this is a significant development in terms of our public culture with respect to understanding not only parts within, but even parts above
Mm-hmm,
in
mm-hmm.
terms of bodies, and really in some ways seeing human beings as sort of middle creatures, in that we are certainly being in some ways possessed. And I'm not using that word in terms of a theological word necessarily or an exegetical word, but possessed by certain ideologies. There are modes of being, there are fashions, there are ways of communicating. It seems that human beings, in fact, are always having things above and below us sort of flow through the operators of our mouths and our eyes and our physical limbs. And so, I was curious about how is this really going to begin to change our public assumptions of what human beings are? Because it seems that, especially since the Enlightenment and probably before, we very much sort of had an atomistic model of what each individual is. And I see the entry into this as probably a significant sign that our models of regard for individual human beings are probably in process of a pretty significant transformation, which will probably bring back, Platonism as a living thing, as a collective thing. It's going to impact, I think, probably a lot in terms of how we as societies move. So I don't know what, is that making any sense to you?
A lot of sense. So where to start? I think the idea that, that Taylor talks about, Charles Taylor, of the buffered self is ending. And I just did a course at U of T on the nature and function of the self, and the idea of the self as a substance, as a unified possessor of properties, a monadic model of the self, if I can put it that way. That's breaking down. It's just not standing up. It doesn't work. It doesn't explain most of the data, both structurally and developmentally. And also, it's coming under pressure, and I think for good reason again, from sort of 4E cog psi, that the self is actually it's a transjective. For example, I have metacognition, which is central to my rationality, which lets me to reflect on my own cognition. How do I get that? Well, what I do when as a kid is I imitate you taking a perspective on me. And I do that enough so that I can then do it when you're not around. And then I don't really need to think about you anymore. And it's just become part and parcel of who I am. And is that my identity? Is that your identity? It was your perspective originally, but it's now a function of how I am metacognitively rational. And this is part of the so this is first point I'm making. This is part of the overall thing about how the imaginal is being found at the heart of the rational. And this is, I mean, from a Neoplatonic framework, this is a deeply religious thing to say. Is to say, these are the way we, the imaginal and the rational are not opposed to each other the way the Enlightenment told us. They're actually deeply interwoven with each other. And so that's the first part. The second part is that, these entities, even just the parts, we'll put aside the allies for a bit, they're weird. They're like Lerman's How God Becomes Real, right? They're not real the way stones are real, and they're not real the way pain is subjectively real. And that's why I have this term. They're transjective. They fall, but they're within us and without us, just like my metacognition, by the way. They're within us and without us in this really, really strange way. And it's like, what are we going to do about that? And one thing we can do about that, I think, is we have to move from, and of course I've been arguing for this since Awakening from the Meaning Crisis, we have to move from a substance ontology to a dynamical systems ontology. And as I've been talking elsewhere deeply, I think we have to move to a what James Fuller is arguing for, that the ground of reality is pure relationality in a really profound way. And so that's sort of my response to you. I think what's going to happen is we're having to admit two things: the imaginal within the rational, and we're going to admit the self is dialogically developmental. And then putting those two together, we have to come into transjectivity about what a self is. And Buber was on about this a long time ago. I, it, I, thou. The self isn't a single thing. And then that gets you into transjectivity. And as Lerman points out, transjectivity has been the sort of perennial domain of religion and spirituality, and the philosophies that have a serious religious over and undertone, like Platonism and Stoicism, and things like that. So I think this is part of something that is going to be really profound. I think it is a rediscovery of Plato's point about how metaxu we are, which is his term for between, and that love is also metaxu, and then beauty is metaxu, and that all of these things now become things we need to talk about in a deep way. I'll turn it back over to you in a sec, but for me, what this means is we can either tighten up, double down, and say, no, I don't want to give up the established ontology. In which case, whoever, I don't identify with that, but if I was part of that, we would be cutting ourselves off from all of the cognitive science that is emerging and gaining a lot of traction, and all of the therapy that is alleviating a lot of suffering. And just with the progress of time, the people that reject that are going to look increasingly bad. It will become an increasingly indefensible position. So that's what I think is. I think that this is a harbinger of that.
One of the interesting things that I was, obviously, when I listened to something like, when I listened to the IFS people talking about things, I always sort of have a theological ear that I listen to. And one of the interesting things that I heard was self, capital S, that Richard Schwartz talks about.
Because, well, let's talk about that.
Yeah, because I'm super curious, because, of course, I thought about this in terms of the meaning crisis, which, is sort of an idea that there's no self there, that I am not a self. And so, ironically, even in a context of very much a substance ontology, the meaning crisis in some ways was it was sort of like an exposure that suddenly there's no there's no me here, that I am simply, I am pure process. And especially if the background is pure substance ontology, then if I am pure process, then I really have no existence. And so it was very interesting to then hear capital S self. So I was, again, curious about your thoughts on that.
Yeah. Well, first, the first point that you just mentioned, and then the self, this idea that it's not real, that this comes up in the course I teach on the nature and function of the self, because people will go through this long argument. These are scientists, right? Cognitive scientists, psychologists, neuroscientists, a little bit. And they'll say, look, the self is this dynamical system. Therefore, there really is no self. And I'm thinking, that's really odd for you to say that, because you don't think anything is a substance. Do you think this table is a substance? What do you think? You're like the scientific worldview you're in is not about substances anymore. It's about dynamical systems. It's about fields. It's ultimately about entanglement, relativity, purely relational, dynamical things. So, I mean, if the self isn't real, then everything that you're pointing to in science also isn't real. There's this weird, I don't know what to call it. I'm not accusing anybody of being a hypocrite, but there's this weird compartmentalization about the use of the word real, which is when we're talking about the self, we can somehow go back to the 17th century with Descartes. That's what we mean by real. But everywhere else, we're up here, post-Einstein, post-quantum, right? Dynamical systems. And it's like, no, you choose. So I just want to make that point. And I had a student actually in my course talking about how this notion of the self that we're talking about is the deeper meta-modern type response to the postmodern critique of the self. So my students are picking up on this in a deep way. It was a good paper, by the way, one of the best. Now the self. Okay. So yeah, I wish you'd seen some of the discussions I've had with Seth about this, with Kazar about this, and with Mark about this, because this bugs me.
Interesting.
So I want to be really careful here. I'm going to invoke my distinction between the language of training and the language of explaining. Schwartz is he's trying to. His theory is a training theory. It's a theory about how to get people to do this, but he slips into ontological claims, and even having the S, capital S, is an implicit ontological claim. And then I get, like, I don't, the ontology of this is weird. So let me just try. First of all, it's equivocal. It moves between being some kind of entity or being some kind of field or place in which things happen. It can sometimes be a role you take, but you can be mistaken about that. It has a relationship to this other thing called the seat of consciousness, which is also, that's language that's used about blending. So when you're blended with a part, the part is in control of the seat of consciousness, and you have to sort of unblend. And the problem with that is, what is that function? Greg Enriquez and Christopher Masterpietro and I got into this when we did The Elusive I, and we talked about how the I is this through line between all these imaginal places from which we are. I can be from here. So there's like this floating state of consciousness. I can be from here. I can be from here, right? And we're doing this all the time. And again, the self seems to be this through line to all of these imaginal where I'm coming from, as we often say, where what my standpoint is for my viewpoint and all that sort of stuff. And so that's there too. And then there seem to be a bunch of functions associated with the self. It seems to be the source of sort of compassion and calm centeredness, and when people feel they're at their best. So there's a normativity to it. The self it's good to be the self, as opposed to, I don't know. And I don't know what you are, what I am when I'm not the self, but I'm still apart from my parts. And so that's all like, So I actually ran an idea by Seth, and he sort of liked it. I ran it by Kazar, and he really liked it. I ran it by Mark. He sort of liked it, but he, he said it was a really good question, but he went back to saying, I think it's much more muddled. But this is what I proposed. I proposed that the self was what I called the anagogic functions. The self is where we hold the two functions that Plato talks about as the meta desires. It's the function that is seeking to reduce cognitive unit dissonance, bring about integration, bring about wholeness, not just pieced together, but each part living as much as it possibly can with the other parts. So there's that function, and we get sort of the meta satisfaction when we have peace of mind, peace in your soul. And then Plato, of course, also argues we have a second function, which is am I in contact with what's real, or what's really real, within and without. And I proposed to Kazra that maybe what the self is the self isn't a thing, it's those functions. Yeah, it's because those functions sort of gather all these different things together and clarify them and get rid of some of the muddle. Um, and so that's my best take. And two out of the three interlocutors thought it was really good. Mark thought it was good, but like I said, he thinks that sometimes that's what the self is, but some other times it's these other things. And then I just sort of beg off and say, well, then it's just equivocal and you're not saying anything. That like you're just being confusing. Not him, the theory.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So that is my attempt to understand it, because it is a mess. It is a mess. It is a mess. And ontological and epistemological, not therapeutically. Therapeutically, I can tell you that your memory is like a building and do all kinds of stuff to train your memory. That's not how your memory works. The standard Vervaeke shtick, right? I get that. And I'm not going to telling anybody how to do IFS. I'm not. But I'm saying if we want to make sense about what this is, so we can plug this into cognitive science, and Mark said, yeah, keep doing that. Then these questions come up. And that's my first shot at trying to bring some stability to what this is.
Yeah. Well, that's super interesting, because when I heard it and I was thinking of you, I really wondered, what on earth do you do with this? And I think you're right to have the distinction in terms of ontologically and therapeutically, because the whole model revolves around this self, and then this whole language with respect to the self, with all of these other parts and the firefighters and the burdens. And I mean, you just and to me, it seemed like a fairly, scalability, of course, is something that, I've talked about for a long time, because, I just had a conversation yesterday with a community, and, part of what I challenged them on is that so many of their ideas are, these are wonderful things for people who have IQs north of 130 to spend a lot of time doing, but the vast majority of the population is down here, and quite clearly Schwartz has developed a therapeutic language that seems to scale fairly well for people. The language is imagistic, and it's functional.
Narrative. It's narrative.
Yeah, it's extremely narrative. It seemed like a phenomenally narrative. I mean, it really is. Now, obviously, he takes, he was a family therapist before, and then he just basically switches it down. And there are other elements that want to apply this, sort of switch it up, when they talk about consulting with corporations, which, of course, look at the word there. You have a corporation, you have all these parts in the corporation, but then you're going to have similar interesting questions with respect to the self of the corporation when you take that model and you flip it up and you try and scale it up. So to come back to it seems to me that for part of what happens in the Enlightenment is that, given the political distress caused by competing ontological religious claims, that states basically say, we have enough that we can agree upon here. Let's sort of park ontology over there. There's probably enough commonality between the ontology, and let's take all of this stuff and let's push it to the side, and let's sort of bracket everything, and we'll sort of keep things in the area of epistemology, and that's what will work. And as long as things seem to function well enough, and that's, of course, where you get into this dead reckoning type of dynamic. And one of the things listening to a lot of IFS is quite clearly Schwartz's theology of the self has a religious valence. I mean, the self, in that sense, the self is always pure and perfect, and the self can do no harm. There are no bad parts, but the parts are, and I part of me deeply appreciates the, that kind of the posture that he has with this stuff. And because, it's a posture that I very much feel comfortable with. We're going to approach with curiosity. We're going to approach with compassion, all of his C words. And I think that's super helpful because so often people who sort of approach with a defensive or an angry or a hostile intent, you're just simply not going to get anywhere with people, or even with the parts within people, if you sort of work that way.
Yeah, totally.
And so, but yet, so then as we watch this thing develop, then I've been reading Faulkner's book, where so
I'm going to
now
be talking to Faulkner at some point soon. We're trying to get it arranged.
Oh, really? That'd be wonderful.
He reached out to me. He wants to talk to me because he saw some of the videos with Seth. Yeah.
Okay. So it's, and of course, then we're going to come into questions of, all right, what are, I mean, I found legacy burdens so interesting because even, as you talked about earlier in terms of this metacognition, so much of how we are formed is, of course, how our parents are seeing us. I mean, psychologically, we've known this for a very long time. And so you have, we are formed multi-generationally. And in some strange way, I am continuing a story that my father participated in and my grandfather participated in. And of course, we've had religious models that have very much been much more curious and interested about multi-generational persons,
Asiatic religions.
But even the patriarchs, I am the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. You hear that again and again, and I am the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob.
Or even Christian heretics like Origen. Yeah.
So these kinds of things have been with us for a very long time. And so what's so interesting about your Hermes story is, again, okay, what is this? Now, I completely understand that a whole bunch of, let me say this. Part of what happens in the Enlightenment is there's a filtering. It's sort of like they have filters with mics that cut off all the resonances above and cut off all the resonances below. It's sort of the inversion of that happened in the Enlightenment. And before I went into missionary service, this was an area of exploration for me, because part of what happened in the mid 20th century is that, in the colonial period, missionaries would go out from the world that had been deeply impacted by the Enlightenment. They'd go into Africa and Asia and places that were not connected up with the grids, and they would find all kinds of strange things going on, and they would just sort of dismiss it. Eventually, missionaries began to, listen to the people that they were supposed to be talking with, and understanding that there was quite a vivid middle realm in there that, for a whole variety of reasons, was sort of shut out. And in fact, and once you start paying attention to this, you begin to notice it. And you can notice it in biblical studies as well. For example, I'm currently just preaching through the end of the book of Acts, and Paul is on this ship. He's getting transported to Rome, and a storm comes up. And it's very interesting because what often, if you read towards the end of the book of Acts, angels keep popping into Paul. And I think Christians sort of read over this often. And they just sort of think that, they don't ask. And again, it's so fairly low resolution. We tend to only see what we're looking for. But if you start reading the scriptures and you start asking yourself, how much are angels involved in, let's say, running messages from God to, the patriarchs or the apostles? They seem quite involved. They're always sort of doing it. And again, I'm speaking from Protestant, and I know how to talk to Protestants because, if it's in the Bible, you kind of have to not sort of shuck it away too easy. Yeah. And so, part of what happened in missiological circles in the mid to late 20th century was a little bit more appreciative inquiry about this middle sector that had been sort of dismissed.
Oh, that's interesting.
And so then you begin to recognize that, there are a lot of interesting things going on. And part of it was that a lot of this stuff never really went away in the West either. You just lost status if you would admit to someone what you really thought. And you might tell it to a family member or someone else like that. So there's a lot going on in this, and part of what I think is in fact going to be happening is that this middle realm is going to once again be a part of Western experience. And I see that now with what we started talking about earlier, that we're understanding the self as this dynamical system, but then we are going to have questions about, okay, ontology. Well, what exactly am I? And with, I think you've been very prescient in noticing a meaning crisis, which meaning crises happen fairly regularly throughout history as we go through transitions like this.
And I argued that too.
Yeah. And part of this transition is going to be this question of the self. And whereas we've been skeptical of agency above or below, now ironically we're sort of skeptical of our own agency. And so we're going to be more and more curious, I think, and open to the questions of other agents above and below, and then having now to factor that into, okay, how do we live? Part of the books I've been reading, I read They Flew recently. I've been reading another book on the Enlightenment, where it's very interesting that a whole bunch of sort of Catholic Protestant fighting, gave rise to all kinds of levitation by a variety of saints. Witch trials sort of intensified. I mean, if we sort of thought that this was sort of a spectrum that happened, you would expect way more witch trials in the ancient world, and for them to sort of, it's right at the cusp.
Yep, right.
And so, my question is, okay, so then now you have an experience of, and it seems the way you talk about it's not quite apart, because, but again, we're running with an ontology that we're unsure of. So, I mean, to me, when I heard Hermes, I thought that's actually a pretty reasonable character to arise. Messenger of the gods, given, all of the work that you've been doing. And then, but then the question gets, and, I'll not pick on you, but
no, it's okay. You can pick on me if you need
but
to.
But with Christians, I mean, Jesus is, I mean, if you boil down how many wars in Christian denominations theologically, I mean, so much of this is, well, who really is Jesus? Now, Christians, of course, believe that Jesus rose from the dead, ascended into heaven, and reigns over. And that's obviously a big piece of Paul of Tarsus, because Paul, to the best of our knowledge, never bumped into Jesus of Nazareth before crucifixion, resurrection, ascension. But then, of course, the road to Damascus is what turns Paul around. And again, I think a close reading of the New Testament, including the book of Acts, gives us to imagine that, well, sometimes Jesus is talking, sometimes an angel is sent, but really what is that language? I mean, because you're hearing from me now, but you're also hearing from the internet. And so, I mean, things are going to get very weird, and it's not just going to be, maybe things will get more weird for people who sort of held religion back, but religions are going to get disrupted in this too, because religions always have to adapt to these big changes underneath.
Thank you for watching. This YouTube and podcast series is by the Vervaeke Foundation, which, in addition to supporting my work, also offers courses, practices, workshops, and other projects dedicated to responding to the meaning crisis. If you would like to support this work, please consider joining our Patreon. You can find the link in the show notes. That's very good. Where to start? There's so much in there. It was very rich. For me, there was one aspect of the question on the self. Maybe I'll start there just to lead back into. One of the questions I asked Seth is, what's the relationship between the Jungian self and the IFS self? because officially there's none, but it's like, and as a philosopher and a scientist and a psychologist, I get like, I don't want people when you're doing your therapy, fine. But when we're doing theory, you don't do, right? No. We got to work this out. You got to get clear about it. And the thing that I'm trying to put my finger on is Jung understood, he understood that this relationship with the self, in his sense, capital S within, was terrifically important for our relationship with God. Now, initially he identified them, and then towards the end, it looks like he opens up some space that there might actually be an ontological entity corresponding. I don't know. But I mean, the Neoplatonists who he's kind of stealing from, like Proclus. Proclus talked about the one of the psyche, which is very much like this model I was talking about. It's like the virtual engine. It's the principle of self-organization, not only within, but between. So it's all those functions I'm talking about, and it's oneing us, right? Within and without. But his point was that is how that is the vehicle by which we have participatory knowledge of the one. And this was an important idea, right? So, because it was a different idea than Plotinus. Plotinus had the idea that we could just sort of cognitively ascend to the one. And then with Iamblichus and a bunch of other people said, no. They were trying to say two things. We are actually really embodied. They didn't hate embodiment the way Plotinus did. And the one, ultimate reality, God, is really, really transcendent. And you got to have and so the one within was very, very pertinent to participatory knowing of the one without. And I think for me, Hermes is about that relation. Hermes is not that. He's not the one. I'm not making that claim. But he is what he is in the mythology. He's a psychopomp. He bridges between the mortal world and the divine world. He brings an organizing musicality to the inner cacophony of my psyche, so it becomes much more one within, so that I'm much more capable of oneing without. And you'll have to be patient with me, my friend. I'm struggling here with an emerging ontology, and I'm trying to articulate it as much as I can. I'm trying to use dynamical systems theory, Neoplatonism, and my own phenomenology to get this, but I think that is a central religious function, the presencing of the psychopomp of participation, if I can put it that way, that is going to be brought back in to a lot of religious discourse. And this is a very different model than yourself as just the ego, the thing that you have sort of narrative control over. And so I don't know if that lands for you, but I think the issue, and I'm not going to pronounce it, I'm going to ask you. And so, like I said, this is clearly the role that I just specified of Socrates' daemonium. This is what it does.
Yeah,
this is exactly what it does.
Yeah.
It gives him, as he says in his prayer, it gives him beauty within, and what it makes him at one within, so he can be at one without.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And I guess I would ask you, is there a place for that function, or is that function completely monopolized by Jesus as within you? And that's, and I'm asking that question like really open-hearted. I don't know. I just want to hear what you have to say.
Well, in my experience with people, obviously in Trinitarian Christianity, you've got, God the Father, God the Son, and then God the Holy Spirit.
Yeah.
And, there's one individual who, is always telling me about what his little voice says. And, for him, the little voice is the whispers of the Holy Spirit. I've got other people who are sort of more upfront about that. I've known people who have been very, their dial. I mean, what's so interesting to me in all of this is what I've seen happening in terms of devotional life, Christian formation, spiritual formation in the church for the last 50 years. Even though I think there's a lot of people who will say, well, the culture and science is always sort of above religion, and religion's always trying to catch up. Sometimes it's the other way around with some things.
Totally.
And so, back in the 70s and 80s, even in a church like the Christian Reformed Church, people were, trying to get back to ancient practices, ancient Christian practices. And you've talked about this quite a bit too. Dallas Willard, again, this really phenomenal guy, died a few years ago, became a pretty significant force in evangelical Christianity, was raised Southern Baptist. But, and again, his philosophical study was Husserl, but really got into these questions of, okay, how can Jesus be more real to me? Now, obviously, in Christian terms, this would happen through the presence of the Holy Spirit.
Yes.
But I don't see that there's this mode of relationality has always been in the church.
Well, the saints within the Catholic and Eastern Orthodox traditions, people obviously they have this kind of dialogical presencing with the saints.
Yes.
And of course, that was part of the kerfuffle, or which became bloody warfare in the Protestant Reformation. But I mean, again, outside of the Protestant tradition, there was a much richer sort of inner ontology, or I would say a transjective ontology. Because, yes, of course, there's the Holy Spirit and there's Jesus, but I'm all, but St. Jude is with me all the time, and people would talk that way. Yeah. And also, you brought up something else that is really important here, which is this other notion about this entity, again formed dialogically and transjectively, our conscience. And conscience and temptation are, Paul Ricoeur in Fallible Man and the Symbolism of Evil, he says, when you're being tempted, who's tempting you? Right? Like it's you and it's not you. And right. And also when you're self-transcending, right? Who's doing that? Right. Right. And you get these weird things about conscience. And part of what Hermes is for me is he sits more there in that, what it gives me is a Socratic conscience that is other than I'll use deliberately provocative language, than my Freudian conscience that was given to me by punitive measures and by some of the things that people inflicted on me and tried to do. So what I'm trying to say, and then I'll give it back to you, is that saints and the kind of conscience I'm talking about with Hermes is an ontocentric rather than an egocentric conscience. It's about it's about orienting me to it's about overcoming the supersalience of self-centeredness and orienting me towards reality. It's that kind of existential conscience that Heidegger was talking about when he talks about conscience, which is different than just I shouldn't have done that. I'm trying to make a distinction here. I hope that's helpful too.
Yeah. I think one of the things that very much comes in Christian tradition is the communal aspect of this.
The confession too, for example.
Well, not only the confession, but also, it was really fun that Lerman picked, let's say, the Vineyard Church to join. Took American Pentecostal churches, because especially in Protestant churches, of course, because you have this narrowing. I mean, it's going to be Jesus and the Holy Spirit, and it's sort of the saints are sort of pushed to the side, and it's sort of narrowed in that way. But there's also the aspect in the Christian church where, the Holy Spirit is telling me this. Well, the Holy Spirit isn't telling me that. Okay, well, there's one Holy Spirit. Well, how can we sort of check one another? Yeah. In other words, there's not only a relational connection one-on-one that is internal, but there's also a communal aspect to this.
Yeah, and they're inseparable.
They're inseparable. That's right. and then in the community, they're going to have to weigh, okay, and what is the Spirit saying to us? And even to the point of, as some of the other videos on my channel about the the existential crisis that my own Christian denomination is in, as many have been in. But part of what happens in a Christian tradition is that we engage, we both engage alone inside, but we also engage together. Mm-hmm. And that, I think, is really a crucial aspect of this, because then the question would be, okay, well, and I think that deeply impacts ontology, because someone might view and say, okay, well, this is John Vervaeke's Hermes.
Sure.
But what about, I mean, it was so funny when this came about, because people were talking about Hermes as if this was something just bolt out of the blue. And I used to, when I was a kid, I collected coins, and I'd say, do you know that Hermes was on all of our dimes until FDR died? I mean, there he was. Yeah. And so these characters have been with us for a very long time in a whole bunch of different ways. And part of what happens in a religious community is that they're part of the balance that you sort of want. Not only is, okay, when I'm alone and I'm in prayer and I'm communing with my God, and I'm talking back and forth with the Holy Spirit, and this seems good to the Spirit, I have to leave my office, and now suddenly, supposedly, that same Spirit that's talking to me is talking to my church political adversary. And now suddenly we have to get on the same page. And that impacts, obviously, it cross pressures the ontology.
So I've actually had a conversation with Hermes about this.
Really?
Yeah, about this idea, and he was basically making the argument. I know this sounds weird to talk this way, but he was basically
welcome, John. Welcome to the weird people of the world.
Weird people, yeah. So he was basically making the argument, which is very much like you were making. He was saying, he's saying, no. You know the logos that shows up in Dialogos, that and what's going on inside, they both have to be the poles of what I am for you. And I went, oh. He said, yeah. You can't make this a completely internal psychological. It's like, I am the way to internalize what happens when you're practicing Dialogos. Bring it in, let it change, and then I will help you take it back into Dialogos, and don't try and stabilize it and possess it and land it here or land it there. Let it flow. That was his basic recommendation, which I thought, okay, that sounds good. So that's what I've been practicing.
Oh, that is good. And that is because I think it's essential. And of course, the side effects are going to be when suddenly you find someone else who also claims to be talking to Hermes.
Yeah, that's going to be fun. Yeah.
Because then suddenly a whole bunch of checks and balances and engagement sort of begin to lock in. Because go ahead.
Well, yeah. Well, I'm talking with Barnaby, who does ally work. He's got a channel, but he's made some of this public, so I'm not breaking confidentiality. He had quite a serious illness, and he's still recovering. But he and I are going to talk too, maybe do 2 or 3 videos around this about, what happens when I'm with you and you have your ally and I have my ally, and what does that work? Which is your question. And I think that's a really important question. And what's a little bit frustrating is the Socratic into Neoplatonic tradition doesn't talk about this very much, which I think this is a totally different discussion we could have. This is a historical thing. I think this is one of the ways in which Christianity had an advantage, because Christianity had, where 2 or 3 are gathered in my name, right? But also I'm within you, and the kingdom of God is within you, but the kingdom of God's. Christianity was really trying to organize these all together the way you were saying, and I don't see the same organization happening within the Neoplatonic theurgic tradition. And in fact, I made this point when I was at Harvard, because a lot of them were talking about practices, and I got up and I said, "You're all talking about individual practices," because I wanted to talk about dialectic in the dialogos, right? And I couldn't. I made a good argument, so they were open to it and everything, and and I was invoking the tradition, but there was still this like, no, this is a totally, and it's like, no, that's not for exactly the argument you're making. If this doesn't do the in and out and between, it's gonna get stuck. And I don't know. I haven't seen any videos. I haven't talked to anybody. I'm gonna talk to Kazra soon. Has a therapist ever called up a part or their self and brought that into relationship? It seems not to be the case. That's not recommended. And so this whole, sorry, you're getting me excited. This whole ontological dimension of the intrapersonal and its relationship to the interpersonal is, again, terrifically vague, not only in IFS, but in the Neoplatonic tradition as well, I would say.
That's super interesting. Because, and I've seen this, I remember talking to my father about the pastoral stuff. And one of the things that he said to me is, we're talking about, let's say you have a couple that's in distress, so a marriage is in trouble, and then really ever since the 80s, 90s, a lot of sort of moderate Protestant churches, send people to the therapist. One of the things you very quickly see is that most of the therapists are one-on-one. You're my patient, and the mode I really need to address you is I'm going to bring you, of course, The Sopranos. Dr. Melfi is the great story where if she succeeds with Tony Soprano, he'll be a better mobster. And of course, this is tearing up Dr. Melfi. She's trying to figure this out. And of course, I think, Schwartz, it was helpful that he started with family systems. And he began to see that, okay, for these two parts of this family to actually get along, for at least a little while, you should leave the room and let these two talk, because you're sabotaging what's happening here. But we are very much wanting to go, there are no bad parts. When I hear that, I think, yeah, okay. But again, part of what happens when we begin to level up, and when we are in fact forced to level up, which we are forced to do in our lives, because again, part of the uncomfortable reality of being middle creatures that human beings are in this sense is we simply have to deal with both what is below and what is above. And dealing with what is above means we're going to have uncomfortable conversations with people who are hearing things that we're not hearing, and they're seeing things that we're not seeing. And one way or another, we're going to have to, in all of this, figure out the good. And so I can really see,
I know. I asked Mark Lewis this question. We were in the middle of it, and we were doing this, and his reaction was important too. But I was saying, are parts evil? And he did sort of the usual Schwartz. No, all the parts are good. You just got to be open, and they'll come around. There's an adaptive function. They're just maladaptive. And I said, I have no doubt that that's true a lot of the time. So I said, I'm going to make this really concrete and specific. Can a part lie to you? Because you are saying they have intentionality. Can they lie to you? And he was taken back. And I'm complimenting Mark. I'm not criticizing him. He was taken back, and he went, that's a really interesting question. And I said, why would they not, is it possible that they have goals other than yours? Well, of course they do. And they have intentionality. Well, could they lie? And all the base, his response, which was, he basically said, and this is, again, I'm trying to compliment Mark. This shows he's a good scientist. He said, I hadn't thought of that question. which means in all the literature and all the practice, that question had never arisen.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking that question should arise.
Yeah.
That question should arise, right? I like, why can the capacity, I know that people can talk themselves into things in really powerful ways, and that is a vehicle for self-deception. Rumination is an engine of depression and self-destructiveness and despair. So, like, and I talk about parasitic processing in my work. Like, couldn't we have internalized something, or it evolved or took shape and all of this? And it's just nasty. It's just nasty.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a song by the Strumbella that, there's something inside of me that's trying to kill me, right? And it's like, oh, maybe, And so, anyways, I just wanted to reinforce what you just said. And so I wonder about people. First of all, I don't think, and I asked Mark about this, I don't think people should just pick up this practice on their own. I think they should do some significant therapeutic work and practice it with other people, and then alternate between practicing with other people and practicing with themselves. So that's first. I want to really state that. Secondly, I'm also, and I know Mark wouldn't agree with me on this, and probably not Seth or Kazra either, but I think people should have a significant practice, a sapiential ecology of practices before they take this up. Because I'm not convinced that this can't be a really sophisticated form of self-deception, and I'm not convinced it can't be a way in which we give in to parasitic processing like we do when we eat the chocolate cake. And so I just wanted to say that because I want to make clear, and I keep saying this, I'm trying not to go into this like naively, either scientifically or I guess, I don't know, spiritually. But I thought the point you just made there was a really good point. I don't know if all parts are not bad. What if I was abused and that spirit of the abuser is inside of me?
Oh, yeah.
I that happens. That seems to happen, right? And we got a little bit from multiple personality disorder, right? Where weird stuff like that goes on. And some of the parts that come out there seem to be not good. I don't know. I'm not so. I'm very unsure where the official line from IFS is very sort of short, and I'm not. I'm very unsure.
Yeah.
So I'm not going to start. I'm not going to stop practicing, but I have a much more cautious attitude towards it. Sorry, that was a long speech, but
no, it was a good speech. It was a good speech, and that was one of the questions that I was going to ask you about, because what I loved your conversation with Sam about AI. And Jordan's been all excited on Twitter about large language models. And I said, Jordan, you and John and Jonathan need to talk together, because all three of you are in a very different place with respect to some of these things. And part of
I think I would do that. I mean, maybe I should pick it up again and poke Jonathan and poke Jordan again. About that and say, let's do this, because I think that's a very good point. By the way, just before I forget, Jordan would like at some point for you and I and Jonathan and he to have a conversation.
Oh, okay. Oh, I would love that, obviously. Yeah. But it's, and again, to get back to the communal, and I really love, and again, the conversation you had with Andrew and Christopher was just wonderful, because on many of these levels, just like you said, our practice, we need each other. And yet where you and Sam went with respect to AI and AI sages, I love that portion of the video where, how will we know if we can trust them? Mm-hmm. And how do we know that we can trust the whole Gospel of John is like, how do we know we can trust Jesus? And in many ways, a lot of the sort of de-churching and walking away from Christianity has been, how do I know if I can trust Jesus? And in many ways, and that's, of course, the Jesus that they have been presented with, the Jesus that has come to them. But it's, and I'm not usually I'm not one to jump on someone because they've said I've left the church. And what you said too about your, I know a lot of people might have heard what you said to Andrew and Christopher about this clarifying moment that you had in the gospel seminar.
Yeah.
I didn't see that I didn't see that so much as okay, now I'm done with Jesus. I heard that more as there was a Jesus that I met through the experiences that I had through a particular community. And, whether or not that reflected the community accurately, who knows, because I'm well aware of those kinds of dynamics as well. But in a sense, I am no longer held by, we can use IFS line. I no longer have to hold this burden that I held with respect to Christianity, and I am free. Yeah. And, to me, that sounds healthy. And again, in the context of where you had this, I don't know if it's fair to call it a breakthrough or not, but you had this breakthrough. It was in a context of multiple people who, by almost anybody's by almost anybody's measure, would be significantly mature Christian leaders and teachers. And to me, that just talks about the fact that there's no question we need to have individual work and individual practice, but that is best done in deep community with others, where we're always checking each other, because is the Jesus that I have in my head, now this gets into a certain degree, there is a true Jesus. I mean, obviously Christians say he's seated at the right hand of the Father. Okay. And what that means is that Jesus, Christianly, that Jesus won't lie to me, but that Jesus may very well tell me a whole bunch of things that I don't believe, that I don't want to believe, and that I don't like.
You in one of your thumbnails, you called him Sneaky Jesus, which was really interesting. I think, I mean, there was a whole bunch of things that were happening at that same time around all of that. One of the things that became clear to me is, and part of the unburdening was, when I was doing After Socrates, I made an argument at the very beginning that I was relieved to give up the quest of trying to separate the philosophical Socrates from the historical Socrates. And that the attempt to do that, as far as I can tell, is a catastrophic failure. I'm not saying that, I'm not a mythicist. I don't think Socrates is a myth, even in the good sense of the word. I think there's a historical figure, and we can ask historical questions about Socrates, and we should. But I don't think we can pry those free from the philosophical. And Plato says this in the seventh letter. He said, I've given you a Socrates who's younger and more beautiful. It's just like, oh, and Plato's telling you this clearly, right? And I don't know if this will upset Christians or not, but part of it is I gave up, right? I tried to, there was this distinction, and it was kind of the inherited from the Enlightenment into sort of liberal theology, between the Jesus of history and the Christ of faith. And part of what happened is I gave up trying to do that. It was like, I don't, you can't separate how he was taken up from people from who he is, because I don't believe in a monadic self anymore. I just don't believe that. And so, and he himself has probably said something like, where two or three are gathered in my name, there I am also. And so it's like, he even didn't seem to identify with himself in terms of just his lexical, indexical here now in Nazareth. He seems to have his, I don't know. And when you look at other figures, Socrates has that too. And I'm not lumping them all together. I know you're a Christian, but what I'm saying is, if I were to level that criticism against what Jesus says, I see many other really pivotal figures having this much more dialogical, transjective, amorphous sense of who they are and what they are. And then I started to realize, oh, that's actually helpful, because I was reading a book by a Zen Buddhist on Jesus, and I was going, this is really good. And I wanted to say, right, that's good. That's good. Well, of course, there's no historical connection between Zen Buddhism and Christianity, but maybe there, right? If I stop trying to parse these apart, oh, well, maybe that's right. And when I did that, not only was Jesus more imaginally present for me, he came alive for me again.
Talk more about that. What when you say he came alive for me again, what does that like?
He went from being an idea I have about a person to even an imaginal to being something that grows, lives, changes, flows. And I don't know if this is heretical or not. I'm really not too concerned about that. But I don't want to be offensive to you because I love you. But
you won't offend me, John. Just be honest, and we'll be good. Trust me.
Okay, so for me, it's like because this is how Socrates, when I was after Socrates, when I did the whole of after Socrates really became alive for me, because I realized, like Socrates isn't static. He's not. There's a living, growing presence of his perspective, his persona, and his way of participating in being that's alive for me. And where it is, and my knowledge of him and my knowledge of myself, or participatory knowing, I can't cleanly pull them apart anymore either. And I'm going to stop trying to do that. That's what I mean. I don't know if that's helpful.
No, it is. Well, and to me, to come back to what we were talking about earlier, part of what's exciting about the obviously difficult transition that we are at culturally in terms of our collective images of self and being are that there is, when we talk about Christ in me, it's way less strange than it was in, let's say, a modern frame.
Yes, it is. And also, maybe also Christ between us.
Yes.
Right. I mean, the body of Christ, given all the conversations I've been having around, collective intelligence and distributed cognition, that becomes also a much more plausible notion. And the idea that there are imaginal bridges that allow us to internalize that body.
Right.
And I've said this to you before, and I don't know. I just don't know. It's like, where in Christians the internalization of the spirit of the church and Christianity separates off from the Holy Spirit and Jesus. I can't see that. And that used to bother me. And in a similar way, it's not bothering me anymore. And it's like, maybe that was the intent. Right? If this is his body, maybe that was the intent. I don't know. And remember, I prefaced it by saying I don't know. I'm not making a claim to know. I'm just telling you that I used to see a problem there. I don't experience it as a problem now. It's like, okay.
Well, and again, back to, the Christian Reformed Church is having this just, ugly, and it's painful in a church like the Christian Reformed Church, which is just many, many extended family networks, who's an immigrant church, small number of people come from the Netherlands, they grow and they flourish and they're all interconnected. And then you have a fight like this where it's kind of pulled apart, and, all of this language of the body of Christ and even to say, look at Tom Holland's thesis where, Jesus and his spirit just infiltrate, infiltrate a culture. And I think part of what bothers us, again, I think is sort of an imagination shaped by modernity that has to sort of line everything up, because there's plenty of reason to critique Holland's thesis, to say, oh, come on, it's overblown, what do you mean? But at the same time, you begin to say, my goodness, Jesus is all over all over us and through us and in us. And even when Jordan Peterson would say things to Sam Harris, basically that he didn't use these words, but there's even some Jesus in you, Sam. It's in there. And, you might not like that, but actually some of those pieces of Jesus are probably some of the best pieces of you. But as you well could say, Plato also has lived on in the West. And we don't have this language, but the spirit of Plato, it's not something that stretches English very far at all. Has infiltrated us and many, many other figures through time. But then again, in a religious mythology and cosmology, there are certain, and I think there are certain constraints. And I think part of the anxiety of modernity was, you start talking this way, it can go all over the place. And that's absolutely right. We've all seen that happen. And so what you really do want are constraints. And constraints that are historical and tested and never perfect, but at least something that overall we could say, yeah, that was a good thing.
So let me address that, because I think it's important. So I have sort of the beginnings of a theory from the presencing literature, because we can now sort of almost create these sense of presence. And the fact that they do weird things, like the John Geiger thing about the third man, the guy who falls off do you know that story? Yeah. And it's like, whoa, what's going on there? Right. And that's irrespective of people having a religious background or not.
Right.
But I was thinking, okay, so there's ways in which we can access that information and sort of give it a personified presence. And then it occurred to me, and of course we do this every night. This is what we do in dreams. We have a spirit, like you said, there's a whole bunch of stuff, associations. And, a lot of dreaming is just getting rid of stuff. I get that. But sometimes, like I had a dream recently where somebody came up to me and they said, well, why do you want to get beyond the self? And I said, well, I want to know what it's like when I'm there. I want to see. And I'm thinking, and I wake up and I'm thinking, what's going on in that dream? And who's the person who's talking to me? And you have the lucid dreaming where you can talk to people and they seem to have a perspective and awareness that you don't. That's well replicated. And I thought, well, and the Greeks had these dream factories where people would go in and they do all these practices of incubation, right? And they would literally try to constellate what we're talking about, like the spirit of Socrates, and where you're talking up, and they would have dream, like there was this huge, they were like dream factories. Yeah. It's in the literature. But here's the thing, and this is Jung's idea about, myths are public dreams and dreams are private myths. But that was always, and this is to your point, this was always held in tension by the collective intelligences generating of mythology. And these two things had to share the same language. So there was important constraints about how it shows up in your myth, how it shows up in your dream has to make use of this. Now, it's also that this can change this, but this gets to change. You see what I'm trying to get? There was this mutual constraint, kind of like the way you and I individually speak English, but we didn't make it.
Right.
But we have to follow how everybody else is talking about it, the collective intelligence of English, but we can also influence it. And, people now use the phrase a lot that haven't even heard of me, the meaning crisis, right? And I've noted that.
Like, you stole the culture, at least a little bit of it with that phrase, John. Congratulations.
So do you understand what I'm trying to say? And I know there was also there was literature around this in the Middle Ages within Christianity too. I know Augustine gets terribly worried about whether or not he can sin in a dream. Yes. So what I'm trying to say
and I'll say contemporary Christians worry about that too. It's amazing how often a lot of this stuff doesn't go away. It's not seen by the people we're watching. And so it doesn't get recorded.
Yeah. So that's interesting. Well, that doesn't surprise me, but it did surprise me. But what I'm saying is I think IFS is plugging into a function we already have of taking spirits we have internalized from the external, like we internalize for metacognition, and taking that function and personifying it, but doing it while we're still awake, but doing it imaginally, and then we interact with it. But I think, and to go back, but the private dream needs to have a public myth, and I would hope that a proper discussion, cognitive scientific discussion of the ontology, it's not going to generate that myth. I'm not saying that, but I think it should have a part to play in generating that mythos.
Yeah. Well, and it obviously it comes out of, it's already embedded in a civilization, and
of course.
And all of that is beneath, and we're sorting through it. So that will, and I'll be very interested to see, where IFS goes and how, because obviously it's very new, it's very young.
Well, I asked that question. I've asked that question. I asked especially to Mark, and I said, and he was cagey about it. Again, a compliment to him, not a criticism. Because I said, what do you think about people taking IFS up as a spiritual practice as opposed to a psychotherapeutic practice? And what he did is he sort of folded it back into psychotherapy and said, yes, I get that. But what about, right, where people aren't trying to heal, they're trying to grow or excel? And he said, well, there's an overlap. Okay, granted, but the cultivation of virtue, the cultivation of wisdom, right? This isn't the same thing as I'm no longer torn apart about the fact that my mother didn't love me, right? And both are important. I'm not identifying them. And I couldn't get, and because I think he was being very honest, and I want to praise him, but I couldn't get a clear answer around that. And this is my concern. I think in fact, I don't even think it's going to happen. I think it's already happening. People are going to take this up like they take up everything else because of the meaning crisis. And they're in an autodidactic fashion. They're going to make it into a spiritual practice where the mythology is their autobiography and all of the disasters that is going to have going with it. And so I am concerned about that.
Well, what was interesting to me when I watched it is it felt very at home in a church context, in that all of this using narrative to try to explain what's going on, and especially people who have no training and everything. But again, I think part of, as the religious practices continue to recede, as we have people 2, 3, 4 generations in that have been disconnected from the religious practices, stories, and mythos that sort of grounded them, because we're going to see people not understanding this language of the question you asked him.
Yeah.
Because it's, as someone who obviously lives and works in this all the time, I watch it and it's like, oh, this makes complete sense to me. But all of what you said is also true, that part of what has happened, let me say it this way, because I look at Orthodox, because Orthodox is new on the scene, which is ironic because it's very old. You have Orthodox, Catholic, Protestant, and the Protestants are the newest on the scene, but they're extremely successful. And part of the reason they're successful is exactly what you described. Everything is sort of let loose. But at least part of what I think happened historically in Europe, and you can see this now with sort of the rewilding movements of people like Paul Kingsnorth and Martin Shaw. I don't know if they're sort of on the other end of the corner that come in videos. But part of what happened when Christianity went up into Gaul and England was there was something of if I use syncretism, that's a charged word, but somehow when you look at Paul Kingsnorth going to 50 wells in Ireland, you very much get a sense that, a lot of what happened was Jesus beginning to infiltrate the paganisms. And you see this in Peugeot and Richard Rowland's Universal History, how in time these systems sort of came together, and that system was pervasive enough and in the culture deep enough that it sort of regulated things for a lot of people. It doesn't mean that things didn't go bad, of course they did, but
Yeah.
and sort of what we've had in modernity is that we're getting further and further away from cultures that have some of that mythos that doesn't let things get too crazy.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so it's going to be interesting when you get something new like this. It was interesting, Scott Alexander's write up about that, because we do have fads that sort of go through sciences. And so you get something new like this and it's disconnected. And then I'm sure they're already out there, the Christian psychologists that are doing IFS, and then the theological employments and adaptations that are going to get bolted on. I mean, it's just going to be wild.
Well, that brings up the final point. I know if you got a bit more time.
Yep.
And this is again with the philosophical Silk Road. I do think I'm glad we did it in this order because we've talked about all kinds of concerns, ontological and spiritual and religious, psychological. After taking all of those into account, I still believe that what's happening with IFS is part of this advent of the sacred that I'm talking about. It is a way in which the sacred is trying to be reborn in terms of a dialogical, transjective ontology that doesn't fit into the old models we had. Or maybe it fits into the really old models and doesn't fit into the the only old models. I don't know how to put it, but so for all of the criticisms that I think should be raised and all the reflections and all the questions, I'm still thinking that this is not going to go away because I think it is a way in which the sacred is being born. There's an advent here of it. And it's really interesting because I saw that in Mark, because the way that this is being talked about, it's sacred, it's it's profound, it's imaginal, it's mythological, it's transformative, it's within and without, right? It puts him in, but he was hesitant to use that language. But and for the reasons you just articulated, I think it's just going to keep happening. It's very analogous in my mind, and I think it'll become allied with the way people talk about when the logo shows up in Dialogos, and they start using spiritual language because it's the only language they have. I think people are already using spiritual language about IFS, especially for ally work. They're using spiritual language for the logos. These two things are, as we've been talking about, they're very interpenetrating and talking to each other. I think this is this is my view, that this is part of the way in which the sacred is trying to give us a new cultural cognitive grammar. And it's not just a theoretical thing. It goes into the guts of who we are and how we are with each other and how we are in the world.
No, it's interesting to me that on one hand, we are seeing the relationship, and one thing that is always behind our conversations is we're dealing with pluralism, and so we default to a word like the sacred because
yes,
and it's and it when I think about how this continues to move and progress, I think about this little corner of the internet. I think about the conversations that we're having across boundaries that have in previous times been battlefields. And we're having, while not necessarily giving up our individual networks of relationships, we are in fact exploring appreciatively over these lines and growing from each other. And I don't think we have the language yet for, I mean, Peterson talks about the counter enlightenment, and I usually talk recession of modernity, but that's not quite right either. We don't have it. And what we mean by the advent of the sacred, I mean, because obviously you cannot have a functioning system without something that functions as sacred within a particular system, and
Yes.
both large and small. And so then when we say the advent of the sacred, what are we thinking? Are we thinking we're going to make progress beyond pluralism, or what are we looking
So
for?
I don't know. I mean, part of it, that's the quest or the pilgrimage of the philosophical Silk Road, because I don't think that we should just sit back armchair to try to answer that question.
No.
And so I've committed myself to doing as deep of an exploration as I can on the question. So I take the question seriously. I'm not going to offer an answer to it. What I'll say is what I mean by the advent of the sacred is we're getting some pretty new wine that doesn't seem to be fitting into the old wineskins anymore, and it's bursting things.
Yeah.
And that's what I'm talking about.
Yeah. And I would say that I certainly don't expect an answer from you, because in many ways, the answer to these questions are our lives.
Yes, and that's, they have to be. And I mean, the whole argument I've made about non-propositional knowing, I feel responsible to it in a deep way, that ontological conscience.
Yeah.
So I think we should wrap it up. We could probably talk about this forever, but I'd like to give my guests the last word. First of all, I want to thank you. I mean, you were a guest, but you actually gave me an opportunity to talk quite a bit. And that's because no matter where you are a pastor, and that came through in a wonderful way. But I hope you felt that you got to participate as deeply as you wished. And I also want to give you thanks, and I want to give you the opportunity for the last word, whatever kind of word you want it to be.
Well, I always enjoy my time with you, John, and my word is this: I know some of what I do makes some of the people around me quite nervous and disagree with me, and that's absolutely okay with me. I was part of the self that I received from my parents is a pretty durable one and a pretty confident one, which was a tremendous blessing. But John, I greatly admire your honesty and your willingness to share your journey as publicly as you do, because I know that is that is not easy, and it doesn't come without cost. But I think this journey that you have been on has very much helped others who have maybe had certain similarities in their journeys. So they are watching you and watching the care and love and patience that you are using with yourself, and the honesty of your sharing. And I think that does the world a world of good. And so I just want to thank you for what you do and how you do it. It's a really big deal.
Thank you, my friend. I will. I'll reach out to Jonathan and Jordan about the LLMs, and also about the four of us having a recorded conversation.
Okay.
Take good care, my friend.
Sounds wonderful. Take care, John.